Hello beautiful people, and welcome to Tremendous Testicles of History, with me, your host, Danny B. In the last episode, we discussed the tale of Gaius Marius, and whilst I thought that was a great introduction for Tremendous Testicles of History, this week I thought I'd take it a little closer to home. Today we'll be telling a story that most people in this country do not know but runs to the very roots of our nation. The story of the last great explorer of ancient regime France, Marion de France, and the greatest chief in Ngāpuhi history, Te Kauri. Whilst it would be nice if our story could begin with Marion de France's arrival in New Zealand, first we must speak a little bit about the man himself. By the time he would arrive, he would be 50 years old and a veteran of 3 wars, well respected and beloved by his men who spoke highly of his competence and his abilities as a leader. In his earlier life, he had fought Iroquois, Comanche, Apache, and various other confederations of native people, British regulars, Scottish Highlanders, and he even saved the last King of Scotland after the failed Battle of Culloden, so this was by no means an uninteresting man. So how did a 50-year-old veteran come to stare at the high peaks of New Zealand's mountains on a chilly morning on the 10th of March? Marion de France, by all accounts, should have not been there because he was at the very end of his career. After a long and illustrious life in service of the French crown, he had settled for a quiet life as harbour master in a small island in the Indian Ocean. Whilst there, he had come across the accounts of various explorers who had searched the Pacific in search of a great southern land. It had always been assumed that because Eurasia dominated the northern hemisphere, it must have a natural equal in the south. It was the search for this that brought Marion de France to New Zealand. It was never his original intention to arrive here, and I think it worthwhile here to stop for a brief moment and ponder an interesting point that came across my mind whilst reading this story. Marion de France paid for half of this adventure himself. He mortgaged everything he owned, which was a lifetime's worth of savings, to fund this. This is like if Elon Musk mortgaged all of Tesla to fund a rocket to send himself to Mars to find aliens. That is essentially what Marion de France had done in his search for the great southern land. So I had spoken previously about Marion de France's orders for New Zealand. Because it wasn't pure chance that had brought him here. His initial mission was to scout the Pacific, but he was ordered in the event of any kind of problems or if he had any damages to his ship to make it to New Zealand, and that's why he arrived in the Bay of Islands. He was here purely to explore. This was a good 100 years before the age of colonialism. Europeans were not yet leaving Europe to go and settle in new lands. This was purely to discover the people, the customs, and the culture of those that inhabited these islands. It would be very much as if we discovered an alien race today. But our main protagonist in the story could never have known any of this, for he would have lived in a world as different to the world of the French as night and day is to us. When Te Kauri's people first arrived in New Zealand, at least 500 years before Marion de France, at least, it was a land inhabited by eagles the size of fighter aircraft, and giant birds that walk the land the size of elephants. The kind of culture that will produce in isolation is completely unique in all the world. It was a modern culture that lived with dinosaurs, and the effect upon the people would be dramatic and have a huge impact on the story. In New Zealand at this time, in particular in the Bay of Islands where Te Kauri resided, it was a political powder keg, and it's something that is very hard for us, well for many of us to understand today, that New Zealand at time of European arrival was something akin to medieval Europe in terms of how it was divided into different tribes, different sub-clans with different political affiliations, all moving in alliances. It was a very complex system, and when the Europeans arrived, it was something beyond any of them ever could have imagined. People riding islands powered by the clouds into their bays. That's why the first word ever attributed to Europeans was not Pakeha, but Atua, which is the word for god or superhuman being, because what other conception could you place upon a people that looked nothing like you and did things that seemed supernatural? Now, as Marion de France would sail up the coast in search of a good harbour to repair his ships, he would stop in at small, abandoned Maori villages and search for scientific keepsakes, maybe even some mementos. I mean, the man's on a holiday, give him a break. The things he would take would leave the local people startled. It just didn't make any sense. It would be as if an alien went into your house, took a pot plant, a small stuffed giraffe, and left everything else intact. It would make no sense, and so the word for Atua quickly changed to the word Tapua, which is the word goblin or demon or being of the other world, as they were clearly not of the same make as Maori, but their motivations were not clear to them within their own cultural context. And now, I think we're gonna have to hold up a fucking minute, because this isn't perfect history, this is tremendous testicles of history, and let's take a fucking moment to consider the beautiful testicles of Te Kauri. For when the rest of his people observed these newcomers to the land as goblins, demons, bringers of pain and suffering, as lords of the underworld, he saw them for what they were, and he was the first to see them for what they were. For when they sailed into his bay in the Bay of Islands, he was the first high chief to ride out in his waka to challenge them. The balls of the fucking man. Barack Obama would not jump in an F-16 to go fucking meet the aliens if they flew, and he'd seen someone else. Te Kauri rode out himself as the leader of his people to encounter these aliens and meet them head on. And what made this first meeting unique, once both sides had gotten over their cultural aversion and misunderstandings? By the way, it would be worth adding here that the French had a Tahitian translator, as Tahitian and Maori are mutually compatible. The more you know. Anyway, what made Te Kauri's encounter unique and what makes him the protagonist of this story is that although Maori had encountered Europeans before, this was the first up close and personal meeting, and previously whereas Maori had fled in terror of these strange looking white men, Te Kauri was the first to start inspecting them on an observational level. To not look at them as supernatural beings, but as human beings with wants, needs, and things that he could use. And Te Kauri, I believe, was the introducer of this new word for Europeans, Mai Tai, metal. As Te Kauri was perhaps the chief who succeeded more than any other in achieving access to metal for his people. And this would dramatically upset the power balance in the Bay of Islands and lay down the course for the tremendous testicles of history moment. Yet, for whatever intentions Te Kauri may have hidden up his sleeve, the first encounter, by all accounts that have been handed down to us, went remarkably well. The relationship between the Maori and French was stellar. The French established their base camp on this island, began repairing their ships, and the Maori were keen as beans to fucking help them. And that's just startling to us, and the relationship between the Maori and French was tremendous. It was a tremendous testicles relationship in every way possible. There was even multiple accounts of casual and consensual sex going on, sanctioned by local chiefs, who would bring their wahine onto the boat and be like, hey boys, fucking anyone? And if the French refused, they would be offended. Like, what, you're saying our women aren't good enough, dog? Like, what, you travel all the way around the world and you don't even want to smash the local. And aside from fun casual summer flings in New Zealand, many personal bromances were also formed between French officers and chiefs. And as much as this was opposed to Maori custom, it shows you how close and how well these people were getting along. Chiefs were normally considered tapu, but some of the highest chiefs of sub-tribes of Ngāpuhi would go out with the French and just go fishing with them. They didn't even speak the same language, but they wanted to be friends. And that to me says a lot about human compatibility and how a negative narrative of history is just simply untrue. Events may have unfolded a certain way, as we shall see shortly, but it didn't always have to be so, and there were many close friendships between the French and Maori that Maori would regret well into British colonisation in the next century. Yet after several peaceful and much beloved on both sides weeks together, the cracks were beginning to show in the relationship between Maori and French. Perhaps that statement needs a caveat, because the caveat would tell why the cracks began to show in the first place. The French, perhaps in naivety, perhaps in wishful thinking, or perhaps due to the good nature of their captain, Marion de France, refused to see the Maori in a negative light. Marion de France was famous as quoted as saying that if we do them no harm, surely they will bring no harm to us. The French were deeply enamoured with Rousseau's idea of the noble savage, and they refused to see the political machinations going on within New Zealand, as the French had dangerously upset the power balance in the Bay of Islands. And as I said earlier, you have to think of New Zealand as medieval Europe, with multiple clans and tribes just like countries and nations, all competing and vying for power, and they're all relatively equal. Any imbalance in the force, and the whole thing goes to shit, and the French had caused this. The French had started to see small battles occurring amongst Maori that they had never seen before, and many French who were veterans of the 7 Years' War and the War of the Austrian Succession were starting to note that the Maori did not fuck around. These people were not peaceful savages, they were warriors. It was a warrior culture built around chiefs in a hierarchy, and they began to get very concerned. But our main man, Marion de France, sadly for his sake, felt no fear. This next chapter, if this was a book, would have been titled The Theft of a Cutlass and the Death of a Captain, for tragically the two events will be more closely linked than historians like to give credit for. As close as the relationship had been, as stated previously, cracks were beginning to show. Both politically and economically, pressure had been placed upon local tribes that they were not prepared for. Conflict had begun. Marion unfortunately refused to pick a side, and this would be his death knell, as there were multiple competing alliance blocks in the Bay of Islands. His ambivalence and his refusal to pick a side, as often the case, was picking a side. And as such, Te Kauri began to see a serious threat to his power in the Bay of Islands. One of his warriors, a younger man within his tribe, on a short trip to Marion's ship, would steal a cutlass. After the theft of this cutlass, an armed band would march on a Maori town and try and seize the man. This would begin a cycle that would lead to outright war between the French and Maori. Although this show may be called Tremendous Testicles of History, and rightly so, we shall now for a moment consider the brilliant brains of history, for Te Kauri surely had one with his next move. The Bay of Islands is heading towards conflict, and to a large extent it is inevitable. Te Kauri has the common sense to place his people in the best position to exploit this, so what he does is he looks at the other tribes around him who have benefited from the French relationship and have offended him, and he goes to them and he says, "We will leave your tribe in peace if you go to war with the French." Essentially, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and using the French as the catalyst for this situation, begins to set himself up for the conflict that we're heading towards. The final death knell for Marion is being crowned a king by one of Te Kauri's competing tribes. He is taken onto a hill above Te Kauri's village and has a crown placed upon his head, which Te Kauri is a declaration of war. He has no options left but to eliminate the French and secure the future for his people, so he goes to the French encampment and invites Marion, who is a close personal friend of his at this time, on a fishing trip with 11 of his chief officers. And so these men go on this fishing trip unarmed and in full belief that Maori that have been friendly to them for the past 3 weeks will continue to treat them the same. Our accounts of what happened next are at best jarbled, but it appears that somewhere after Marion and his crew had reached shore, they were ambushed by a large party of warriors, and at this point the small war in the Bay of Islands had begun. Some of the greatest and most tremendous testicles of history will be introduced to our story. The scene is set. Marion lies dead, his navigators and officers slaughtered. At the same time, a band of warriors raids the French masting camp and takes their rudder and rigging, all of the gear required so that they can get home. And all in the meantime, the rest of the French crew, half of which is sick of scurvy at this point, has no idea what's going on. Marion's just disappeared and the Maori aren't coming anymore. They used to show up every day with food and to hang out. One of the boys who had become close friends of the officers had shown up the night before, the night when Marion likely died, and came crying to one of the officers and tried to give him his greenstone pennant. And when the officer tried to return it and to give him gifts in return, the Maori boy refused and left because he knew what was coming. And that, to me, really conveys the human tragedy of this story, for as much as this is about mana and courage and balls, this was a beautiful relationship that was destroyed, and we are still dealing with the consequences of this today. The French crew, in their confusion, sent out a small boat to try and find Marion and to try and find some answers to what had happened to their crew that had disappeared. On their journey to the beach, they discovered a lone Frenchman swimming for his life half mad. Here I introduce to you the OG Jean-Claude Van Damme. This man, half delirious and wounded, told the tale to those that remained of what had happened before passing out in hospital. That night, the remaining French gathered at their camp. They lit fires, they gathered the small cannon they had around, and they listened to the war cries of thousands of warriors as they began to enclose their camp. You can hear the rain on the thatched roof of their small hut. You can look around and see the terror in men's eyes, knowing what's coming in the morning. And then when all hope is lost, Jean-Claude Van fucking Damme decides to wake up. And he walks into this room and he looks around at these scared young men and he says, "We will not fucking die here." He gathers up the men. He looks at the odds in front of him. There is only one way the French are going to leave New Zealand at that point, and they have to take the pa on their island. There are 3,000 warriors estimated between them and this pa, and at this point there are 40 fit Frenchmen left to fight. Jean-Claude Van Damme gathers up the young officers and the young men, and there's 30 of them that decide to go out there and challenge, at this point, at least 1,200 Maori warriors that have surrounded their small encampment. Death is certain, they know it. They know they're going to die. As much as we wish to write off many of our colonial ancestors as reliant upon technology or mischievous or cunning or conniving, let us not forget that this is Tremendous Testicles of History, and these were bad motherfuckers. These were veterans of close quarters combat many times over. So these 30 remaining Frenchmen formed ranks, fixed bayonets, gathered up the weapons they had left, and marched out to face 1,200 warriors. And what did the Maori do at this point? Te Kauri, seeing this, and wearing the clothes of Marion, who he had killed, walked forward to the French to mock them and to remind them of their imminent fate. The French had become accustomed to the Maori totem of Utu and sought some vengeance of their own upon Te Kauri, hiding 10 musketmen in a small bush to attempt to ambush him. As Te Kauri approached, he sensed this and tried to flee. He was shot and wounded, but he managed to escape, and many of his warriors would leave with him. And this is where his genius comes into play, for with him and his warriors removed, the tribes in the Bay of Islands that would have benefited from the French were forced to fight them, and the 40 remaining French soldiers attacked. One might expect a slaughter at this point, and you would not be wrong to expect this, but Maori to an extent had developed an understanding of how firearms functioned, even if not how to use them. They knew that they were devastating, so individual warriors would approach this massive Frenchman in line with fixed bayonets and try and cast spears or try and make a charge or try and make an individual challenge, and they'd just be cut to pieces. The only close quarter battles that we have accounted to us are from some of the French officers as they seized the pa, and it was bloody and it was terrifying. French steel and discipline won the day. Over 300 Maori were killed this day. Practically all of the French soldiers involved were wounded, but none of them died. They all made it home. They seized the pa, they took back their rigging, they slaughtered, they repaired their ships, and they prepared to return home. And as they prepared to return home, they looked upon that same hill that they had first sighted when they approached New Zealand, and who should they see standing upon it, wearing the clothes of Marion de France, that last great explorer of ancient regime France, Te Kauri, victor of the Bay of Islands and greatest chief in the history of Ngāpuhi. Now, chances are, if you are listening to this, then you too reside or come from my beloved country of New Zealand, Aotearoa. The question is where does this story end? Does it end with the death of Marion de France? Does it end with the departure of the French crew? Or does it end with the rise of Ngāpuhi? Does it end with Ngāpuhi understanding of Western technology that they would eventually use in the musket wars to practically conquer the whole of New Zealand pre-Treaty of Waitangi? I mean, people like Hone Heke, like Hone Hikakanga, famous Maori that most Pākehā today even know, at least Hone Heke they know, the roots of his power could be found in Ngāpuhi understanding that came about with interactions with the French in the Bay of Islands in the 1770s. The Flagstaff War would occur less than 50 years later, and by that time, Ngāpuhi would be well prepared to repel British power, ensure the survival of their people into today. You go into the far north, who do you see? You see the descendants of Te Kauri, not the descendants of Marion de France. This story is not one I expect to be typical to Tremendous Testicles of History. For the most part, I want to focus on great men and women that have made all the difference, but I felt like this story was something so cool and so close to our own country that it needed to be told, and moreover, it conveys so well how history is not a story written in stone. Destiny is not always certain, and this story did not have to end the way that it did, and that's why history is full of so many amazing stories. And that, perhaps, is a good ending for this moment of Tremendous Testicles in History.